right. Once again, welcome to all of you. Apologies for starting a bit behind time. But as we jump into the first segment, which is around the changing of currencies, I really wish I brought my mom along with me for today's conference, because for most people, their fear of the future is robots taking over. My mother's fear is Bitcoin. Right. She's terrified about a currency that she cannot see or feel. And the next speaker that I'm about to introduce, beyond the fact that his bio is incredible. I mean, how many soccer fans do we have here? Do we have any soccer fans? Oh, my. So, a little higher with some... I know Bafana is not doing as proud of late. Okay, a few soccer fans, great. So Forbes magazine described our next speaker as the world's first AI football commentator for the UEFA Champions League final. This is a gentleman who also created an app earlier this year that diagnoses the early stages of Parkinson's disease. And I think if you look into your booklets that you received at the door, you'll read more on Babusi Nyoni's biography. So I'd like to welcome him on stage right now as he gives us a quick, exciting presentation. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Hello? Cool. We're just going to start with this video, and then I'll get into my presentation.
Guys, this is always fun. Speaker to stay good. Dang it. Whoops, I was kind of breaking this open so that I could get some circuits out of this so that I can make like a working speaker, but no.
Good morning. My name is Babusi, and I'm a man who wears many hats. I think the most recent hat is that I am an innovator. And when my slides get on the screen, I'll tell you a little story about how at a very early age, when my slides get on the screen, just give me a second. Okay, cool, perfect. All right. So the title of my presentation is Give Me a Break. I had two alternate titles. The first one was Fuck Afrophobia. And then the second one was Men Are Trash. And then I was like, you know what? I could just speak to it and I'll put it on the presentation. But this presentation revolves around how at the age of 6, I broke my very first expensive toy right where that green dot is. I'd walked to town with my mother, and we don't come from a well-off family. And we were in the market in Bulawayo, and I saw this toy gun. It was black. It had, I think, 16 sounds. It was battery operated. It was going to be my first battery operated toy as well. And I basically cried for this toy. I was 6. I was still allowed to cry for things. And she bought it begrudgingly, and we got home. And while she was in the house on the same day, I took this brand new gun outside and I smashed it into pieces, just like that boy in the video. And the reason why I did that wasn't because I hated it or I didn't want it, but it was to see, one, how it worked, and then 2, to see what I could do with the things inside it. I've basically made a career out of breaking things to make new things. Most recently, I worked at MNC Saatchi Abel, an agency here in South Africa, as a creative group head of digital. And then I moved over to Thomson Reuters, where I led the UX design for their early product development labs. And then for the past close to 3 years now, I've been an innovation consultant for the United Nations. And I have recently become an advisory board member for the largest children's foundation in the UK. And I also founded my own agency, finally, and it's called Triple Black because I only wear one color, except for when I don't. So I gave you a bit of a background on my upbringing, but I went to the school called Founders High, and that was the last time I was ever in a classroom. And Founders High wasn't a fancy, I think the term would be Model C if you transferred it over here to South Africa. This was actually my classroom in Form 1. It's basically been the same. There's not been much change. And after high school, I worked like a gazillion jobs. My first job actually was working at a security company, and then I worked in an internet cafe, and then I worked in a film photo printing place, and I just did like a whole bunch of stuff. And throughout this entire period, I was learning how I could change myself to be relevant in spaces. And I now want to just walk you through some of the things I've broken and made anew. And I hope it'll be as entertaining for you as it was for me to make it. So as was alluded to earlier, sorry, my slide's stuck. Yeah. In 2016, while working at MNC Saatchi Abel, I made what Forbes magazine called the world's first artificially intelligent football commentator. And that was done for the UEFA Champions League final of that year. And what this did was it scraped tweets online that I guess football fans would put out during football matches. And it learned how they would communicate about football. And we built this simple decision tree that would look for certain terms and then respond to them for the duration of the UEFA Champions League final. And so I don't know if you know anything about advertising, but the things that are made within the advertising world are very temporary. So you will build something amazing for a campaign, but the moment that campaign comes to an end, you discard it and you move on to the next thing. But I've always struggled with just, foregoing things that you have built in anticipation for the new. So I broke this bit apart, and I took that decision tree and I plugged it into data from the World Bank, and I created a prototype for the prediction of Africa's next refugee crisis. And I spoke at TEDx Cape Town in 2016 about this. And how this works is I noticed that there was a trend in countries that had faced massive migration crises where there were certain data points that were consistent across the board. And I used freely available data from the World Bank to anticipate what countries might be faced with crises that might be spurred by economic reasons or war and famine. And an interesting thing about this talk, actually, if you watch it, in 2016, while there was no actual indicator that it might happen, I boldly declared that Zimbabwe was going to have an economic meltdown within 5 years. And I was like, cool, this is what the data says, and it's going to happen. And so when it did happen, I wasn't surprised at all. But yeah, you should go watch that TEDx talk. And then in 2018, I wanted to do some fun things with artificial intelligence, because I noticed that often when we speak about the technology, we feel scared about it. Sometimes we're intimidated by it because we feel like it belongs to people who hold PhDs and whatnot. So I made a couple of experiments to try and demystify the technology and also, as designing double called it, make it ratchet. I just wanted to make it as ratchet as possible. And one way of doing that was to make a track, a GOM track, because I love GOM, through artificial intelligence. And onto a little more serious note, in 2018 as well, I created this ethics API. And what it basically is a parameterized version of the Ubuntu, I guess, not belief system, but a system of values to allow autonomous software like self-driving cars and software that might influence the way you access credit in the future, to have a value system that allows them to make decisions that affect people's lives. Because at the moment, what's happening is the people responsible for formulating these ethics are people who are mostly white, mostly male, mostly straight, mostly from the global north. And we have had multiple problems with artificial intelligence, especially with self-driving cars, where there are clear biases when there are instances of what is called collision parity, where people of color will be likely hit more than white people. And so we created this ethics system to try and solve for that. This wasn't the most successful thing I ever made, because it was more something that was a shot into the future, but it was still fun to do. And then, oh, this is my favorite. So, still in the same year, I used computer vision to build this app that can rate the Vosho dance move. And basically what it does is, in your phone browser, okay, you don't need to download like anything extra, you don't need extra sensors. It basically marks the points of your body, and then we built this formula that looks at what makes a good Vosho, right? We trained it on multiple YouTube videos of Vosho, so we looked at how low you should go relative to how tall you are. I had like graphs, it was very scientific. And how fast you should come up, and then if you go down again within a short amount of time, you get a higher score. This was really cool, and it got lots of press. And then one thing that I noticed that was cool about it was that there were devices that were accessing this app that were very low end. You know, I don't know if you guys know like Mobicel phones. You know, those are not the fanciest phones in the world, but then what was happening is that people would see or like hear about this app and then go try it out, not with the assumption that it's, you know, cutting edge technology and they want to try out this new tech. But what they knew was that there was a context for the tech, which was, you know, rating a Vosho dance move. And I guess with the responsibility of knowing that there's a willingness to interact with this kind of technology, I decided to break this apart again and see if there was a better use case for it. And what that culminated in was using the same body point parameterization framework that we built to create a prototype to predict what might be Parkinson's disease. And the crossover thinking for this was a lot of the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease is based on symptomatic observation. So you will still go see a healthcare practitioner who will assess over time, amongst other things, of course, the way your body moves and the way limbs move relative to each other, and like the speed and your posture. And these are all things that we learned how to parameterize when we built the Vosho dance app. And so it was easy for us to make this technology work harder, I guess. And then most recently, I built this app. It's called Safe Pace. And it uses data from SAPs to let you know which areas are safe for contact crimes. And this is freely available data as well. And we're working on a version now that not only tells you where is safe to go, but like what times are safe in which places. And that's been cool and challenging to work on. And the most recent thing is this fun experiment I've been working on to predict muggings in Johannesburg. And basically what it does is it looks at the movements that are consistent with muggings, right? So you normally have one individual and several individuals who will be likely behind them. So we look at the proximity of, I'll just call them objects right now, but the proximity of objects to each other relative to one entity, and then an acceleration to that entity. And it's a whole bunch of like tech stuff, but the cool thing is that it predicts muggings, okay? And all the stuff it's not done like for commercial goal or anything. It's just putting the tech out there, I think partly to demystify, and then also, I don't know, to build tools for like future Africa. And why I've been able to do this, and why I think it's important is agility has proven to me to be a currency. I've been able to move in spaces because of my ability to understand things very quickly. I think that might be also in part because I didn't go to university, so I have to learn things in a very different way. So that has also proven to be an asset with the context of where the world is going now. And there's this really beautiful pull quote by this guy who was the former head of Google China. His name is Kai-Fu Lee, and he was speaking on artificial intelligence specifically, but he described the current era that we are in as the age of implementation. He goes on to say that every technology goes through an age of discovery and an age of implementation. And during the age of discovery, the critical work takes place in research labs where scientists make the breakthroughs that move the field forward. But during the age of implementation, the technology reaches a point of practical utility and begins spilling out of the lab and into the world. And with the technology that I have focused a lot of my career on, which is artificial intelligence, there's been a major focus by the West to push research forward and really put like frameworks out there, but there's very little applications of the tech. And if you look at what I did with the muggings prediction, for example, it's not like new or unique tech, right? But to have someone who understands a society or a system well enough to know what to look for and what to parameterize to build things, like I did that in a day. And that's like just one example of the things that people could build with existing technology because they understand context and problems enough to be able to build things with existing tech. And looking at the AI Readiness Index, and this was something that was alluded to yesterday as well, in terms of our approach to the fourth industrial revolution, the Internet of Things and all these things, it's, on a practical level, it would take many, many more years for us to get to the point that we're romanticizing currently. And what we do have, though, and which is the thing that we don't really think about, is as a continent riddled with problems, we have this ability to solve consistently and at a very high quality and at a very fast speed than anyone else around the world. And just another quote from Kai-Fu Lee describing this current zeitgeist. He says, visionary research is no longer the most important element of progress, right? It's either you're doing or you're not, because what's actually happening now, his juxtaposition with the West was also what's happening in China, where China is not leading the research in AI, but what they're doing is the moment any new tech comes out, there are thousands of startups trying to figure out if they can make a product with it to see what sticks, right? They're churning out all these things, and they are leading the race in terms of AI implementation, which is actually where it's at, right? So it's cute to like think about things and spend years, in academia. But what actually matters is what gets into people's hands. And what is the cost of, I guess, this agility as a currency? I think for me, it's time, to be honest. It takes a lot of time outside of my regular 9 to 5 to do the things that I do, and it's not a privilege that everyone has. I know I definitely, if I still worked in advertising with their very crazy hours, I wouldn't be able to do any of this stuff at all. And in a nod to the title of this section, which was Africa to Amsterdam, I moved to Amsterdam 2 years ago, mainly because of their work-life balance and how it allows me to, sustain myself while still keeping my mind engaged and also creating tech that serves the African continent. So a lot of my identity is still very much based here. I literally have almost zero bearing on Amsterdam, so I have no foothold in that tech scene at all. My obsession is just with implementations of technology in Africa. And I've been fortunate enough to have time. And if you've been to any of my talks or seen any of them online, you'll know that what's coming next is very typical. It's a quote from my favorite person in the world. And this was when he was speaking at Oxford University, and he described this currency and what is the most important part of innovation so accurately and succinctly. Time really is the only luxury, right? Innovation takes time, and time also allows you to do cool things, as I have shown you. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you. So I wasn't checking for time, but it was my hope that we'd have a question and answer session now. And if you have any questions, just raise your hand. There's going to be a roving mic, but feel free to ask me anything. Oh, cool. I think you just grab this one, maybe. There's one up here. Yeah, cool.
Hello, yes. So I know this is like high school where there has to be a sacrificial lamb who asks the first question. Yeah. And I will be that sacrificial lamb. First of all, that was an amazing talk. I think the misconception in Africa particularly is that there needs to be a disconnect between art and technology, right? When a lot of research has shown that the marriage between the two is the cornerstone of like some amazing tech businesses. My question to you then is, how has technology impacted your creativity?
So for me, like my foray into tech was a matter of survival, to be honest. So what I didn't speak about earlier was that I actually started out as a graphic designer, and I came to South Africa in 2012 working as an art director at a very small agency. And around about 2013, I realized that the world was starting to have a much bigger it was starting to place a much bigger importance on being online, being digital, and being in tech. So I spent almost all of 2013 at least 4 nights a week, sleeping at 4 in the morning to wake up at 7, just learning how to code. And I learned how to code well enough to initially just to get my websites out and stuff and just try and close the gap in that value chain. But then I think being able to build things like that and experience them as well was like being a carpenter for me. Like, you have an idea for a beautiful piece of furniture and you make it, and once you've made it, that cathartic feeling of like actually seeing your thing live was exactly the way I felt about building like websites and apps and all that. So it's still a very sometimes selfish experience for me because I really do it just so I can feel so good when I put it out there. but it started out as a matter of survival, and then now it's just, wouldn't it be cool if this thing could do that thing? Yeah, cool.
Hello? Oh. Yeah, you know this already, where we failed the Uvosho app, huh? We tried, but we hope still maybe we can still do it. We keep living in hope.
Just give your knees like 6 more months before you try again.
Cool. Might be too late for that already. But that was very cool, thank you. I was just thinking about what you were saying about academia, and what really matters is when people have tech in their hands. And as someone who spent a really long time in academia, I was thinking about that. Okay, what does it mean, you know? Like, how do academics and people like yourself work together?
Yeah.
And I did think that it's really valuable in terms of archiving your own process. For people who are learning, who might be at university, to know what your methodology is, to understand your research moves, you know, even if it's a very short research period, but your methodology itself is super interesting, and I think to share that with other people who are in the learning space is one of many opportunities, I think, in an academic context. I think that would be really beautiful to share.
Cool, let's do it.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I think we had a hand in the back, and then lady over here.
Hi, yeah, thanks. That was a great talk. So I'm from academia, training students to do basically what you do. And so it was interesting that you said you don't monetize. I think that's what I got. And my question is actually on monetization, especially with apps like that Parkinson's disease app, because I think that's what Africa needs. So digital platforms or solutions that really solve Africa's problems. So how have you looked at that space in terms of monetization? And also, in terms of things like Parkinson's disease, are there laws that probably prohibit, you know, using an app, you know, to check whether you have cancer? Because I have some of my students are looking into things like that, and it tends to be a difficult area.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much for your question. So to answer the first bit, I tend to shy away from the part of innovation that requires some kind of like post-product development validation, like selling something or monetizing it. Not because I think that part is dirty, but I think for me, it just takes so much time away from the things that could be done. I think for me, a very high turnover of like things that I make. And I've been fortunate enough that all of them, except for that one that I mentioned, I should have actually put in the slide, all of them have had some impact or have been well received. So I think my role in the ecosystem of innovation, if we'll call it that, is just making things to give people an understanding of what's possible, and also to give technologies context, right? And then in terms of what the implications of like something like the Parkinson's diagnosis app. There are regulations that differ country by country. So an example is I just finished working on this like sexual health chatbot that just answers basic questions. And the guy who I work with, I showed him like this really cool natural language processing framework that I'd like to use instead of this like yes, no. But the problem with that is it's been trained on actual transcripts with medical practitioners that lead to not only diagnosis but also recommendations on which medication to take, and then, you know, like what are the implications of going that far down the funnel. I think it's a conversation that it's an ethical one. You have some areas that have like maybe one doctor per 20,000 people, where it wouldn't be practical for such an in-depth look at symptoms and arriving at solutions. But then, I guess it's the conundrum that we face with technology right now. Like, how much are we willing to give to get what we want?
I'm gonna ask, especially with the connection when it comes to academia and that, especially when you're speaking around the AI index, which you showed in that. And I was gonna, it's more like a recommendation, which I think with some of the people that you need to connect with. And some of them is Professor Chiridzi Mawara, who's the Vice Chancellor at UJ. And he has written 19 books in terms of AI, in terms of that. So they're also finding ways in terms of using such technology, in terms of implementing it, but also based in terms of using African ways in terms of implementing it. One research which they worked on, which was totally engaging, was when they were using Xhosa as a language in terms of trying to put it in terms of AI. And during their research also, you end up finding that within Xhosa, the AI is picking it up as 2 languages. So it ends up, and also you find that also within the clicks itself is like a certain like 10% within the language in terms of that. But they also finding ways, I think, in terms of engaging with what they research and they've worked on with can also benefit in terms of what you're doing, in terms of that. And it's also, I think that's amazing.
Cool.
And it's amazing what you're doing.
Thanks, man. I'll reach out to you for that name again.
Sure, man.
Cool.
Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have time. I'm so sorry. You see what happens when I open up the floor? Then the rest of you, I'm an influencer, aren't I? Last question, please go ahead.
Hi, good day.
Hey.
I was quite interested to find out how do you run a program via Java to capture that sort of data with the mugging scene, because there must be some sort of alert. At the moment something happens, it should have like an alert to say it's about to happen. And then I have a second question I wanted to ask, if you don't mind. Sorry. It was a very sort of controversial movie that came out, I don't know when. Yeah. It's got Tom Cruise. So it's called Minority Report. Yeah. So basically the movie is something quite similar to that concept that you sort of told us about, the way they predict, potential criminals. I wanted to find out the prediction time, because it's a CCTV maybe on the streets. So are you trying to predict the movements of criminals, or are you trying to predict the actual attack that happens maybe 5 minutes before or 10 minutes before? And if so, what would the response be to divert that victim to be attacked by those suspects or criminals? Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much for that question. So the first, just to answer the first question, so I don't work in Java. I'm like a surface level developer. So I work mainly with JavaScript and JavaScript frameworks. So in my thinking for the prototype, I wouldn't want to have like a system that would communicate with the server just to cut the times. So I literally was just going to have some JavaScript event. But the point of that prototype is to give an alert on site. So like just some kind of audio marker. It doesn't have to, like, hey, wait, or something, right? It's just like maybe some tone or something, just so that whoever's there is alert, because they understand that if you hear this thing, things are about to go down. And yeah, it works, like you said, it works with the actual event itself. So it wouldn't just go like way back in time and then assess like people's movements and whatnot. It would be cool if it did, but then also you run into profiling problems. And so it just looks at movements relative to the now, and looking at what we typically have seen in CCTV footage. And the reason why I did that actually was because most times we see these mugging videos like post the fact, right? So there's never like, you don't watch the video and then like this security guard comes running out from under the camera and is like, hey, I'm seeing you do this thing. So it was more, what do we do with all the data that we have and we've collected, and that is always constantly available, because as long as there's inequality, there'll always be crime, right? Cool. Thank you very much, guys.